disabilities, whether in fact we do triage, whether in fact we ensure that triage is happening with disabilities, handle the problem before it gets really bad. And these decisions are the ones that need to be made in this chamber. The people who make these decisions are the people who should be trusted by the people of the province. And even more, the people who are in this chamber should be able to trust themselves to make those decisions. Throwing out each of these questions for infinite amounts of consultation and examination, and not necessarily execution, has become the watchword, and that in itself is also penny wise and pound foolish, because it's a short-term solution. It's a short-term solution to say, let's consult, but not execute the decision, the result of the consultation. I don't know whether that decision is ever consciously made. But you know, maybe it's characteristic, maybe it's a characteristic of a province in which people believe that their vote, their birthright, that inalienable thing is something they'd better handle pragmatically. They better just do whatever and hope for the best. Maybe that's what you get, is a government that isn't able to look at the long-term picture. A government that doesn't perhaps trust itself to be able to make the decisions that represent the will of the people, because it's not necessarily sure that its election itself is the will of the people. And until we have ensured that the people of this province are participants, more than participants, they are the people who set up the rules, have had a really good chance to talk about the rules by which those decision makers will be put in place. Until we've done that, there is no way that we can trust ourselves to represent the will of the people, therefore to make the decisions. We assume that we are making the decisions which represent the will of the people, and we'll have to keep on throwing back over and over and over again for consultation the questions which do not represent the fundamental underlying question: how did the decision makers get there? We've got to allow the people of Nova Scotia to be engaged in this fundamental process. I keep saying it over and over again, but people are afraid. They have voted fear for years, and they're growing up. So what's happening? At this point, until there's been a real reform, they are withdrawing from the process. And that's why we've got this really low turnout. And that is dangerous, because there's a lot of people who aren't participating in or aren't relying on the various sub-bodies which have been set up by the provincial government. And when people don't rely on them, when they don't engage, when they strike out on their own, then as a society we begin to run into problems. And I am afraid that if we in this chamber decide to arrogate to ourselves the right to decide how the electorate will decide, then we are really going to be inviting more and more people to step out, to continue stepping out of the process, to stop voting, and to keep maybe inscribing their will. I did. And inscribing their will in all sorts of other ways, which a large number of us, deem not socially acceptable, and we're going to be left playing catch-up. Not just the 52 people in this assembly, but everybody who is employed as a result of the decisions made by the people in this assembly. And admittedly, that's a large number of people, but we don't want to all be scrambling to play catch-up, because an increasingly large proportion of the electorate of Nova Scotia does not believe that it has been consulted in how the decision makers will be chosen. And it happens in the smallest way. It'll happen in a group of 10 people. It'll happen in a province of 1 million. It'll happen in a municipal ward. It'll happen in a provincial riding. That if people believe that their voice has been unreasonably and unfairly drowned out by the contributions, either illegal or imported, of somebody who actually has no say whatsoever in the community, if that continues to be the case, then the electorate will not respect the will. They will not respect the decisions that are made in this chamber, and we will all pay the price. So the people of Nova Scotia aren't children. They deserve our respect. They deserve to be consulted and asked just how they want to make that fundamental decision which every single one of us has the right to make. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have a few brief words on Bill 117, Mr. Speaker, especially around the amendments, put forward by the leader of the official opposition, a member from Cole Harbour, Mr. Speaker. It's always an honour to stand, and I think it's important to recognize the role each MLA in this legislature plays in the legislative process, especially when bills come through this House, Mr. Speaker, this historic House. And I think it's important we recognize the job and the purpose of why MLAs are here, Mr. Speaker, and it's important that we stand up and debate these pieces of legislation and inform the positive parts of a bill, Mr. Speaker, and the negative parts of a bill, especially as a member of the official opposition caucus, Mr. Speaker. It's important for me to recognize that I have a job to do in this legislature to stand up and debate bills that come before us here on the floor of this chamber, Mr. Speaker, and I'll do that this evening, Mr. Speaker. I support this piece of legislation because it's needed, but I support it in a way that we need to make changes to improve it, Mr. Speaker. All pieces of legislation that enter and go through this process, Mr. Speaker, aren't perfect. We've seen it in history. We've seen it in this session, in sessions prior to this, Mr. Speaker, that we need to work on legislation to improve them, to make sure that they're the best possible changes in public policy that the residents of our province want, Mr. Speaker, and they expect that. And that's why I do support the amendment from the Leader of the Official Opposition on delaying this for 6 months, Mr. Speaker. And it's not delaying it because we don't want to see changes coming, Mr. Speaker. That's not why we're bringing forward this amendment, and that's not why all my colleagues here have been speaking for the past day and a half on this amendment, Mr. Speaker. It's because we know that there's been a flaw in this piece of legislation. This bill is not perfect, and there needs to be changes in it, Mr. Speaker, and government needs to recognize that changes need to come. And I think Nova Scotians want us to stand up and indicate what those changes should be, Mr. Speaker, and I'll take a few minutes in the next little while to say that, Mr. Speaker. One of the big reasons why we want this amendment, Mr. Speaker, is because of the lack of consulting, the lack of going to the public and trying to find out what they actually want, Mr. Speaker, what they expect, what they see needs to happen in electoral reform here in the province, Mr. Speaker. And by introducing this legislation on Friday, we got notice on Thursday, Mr. Speaker, and now we're debating it here yesterday, Monday evening, and also today on Tuesday, Mr. Speaker. If we were not to stand here and debate and try to project what we think are some of the flaws in this legislation, Mr. Speaker, then we wouldn't do it justice. The people of this province would think that we're not doing our job, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's a rushed piece of legislation. This isn't something that can pass this through the House, Mr. Speaker, in a number of days. I know the process in this House of introducing a bill, calling it for second reading, Mr. Speaker, have it go to a law amendments, to have that input from the public, and then calling it for third reading and follow through the legislative process, Mr. Speaker. This isn't something that can happen very quickly. One thing I've learned over the years as being a member of this House, Mr. Speaker, is that pieces of legislation fly through these doors in and out very quickly, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't give a lot of opportunity for the public to have their say. I know government always says, well, the process of passing a bill that the public has and interest groups have the opportunity to put input during law amendments. But, Mr. Speaker, you know and I know that there's usually a day's notice when law amendment is going to be held for the public to make presentations to that committee, to hopefully make changes or bring amendments, Mr. Speaker. So the process is very quick. And we believe strongly that the people of this province would want time to digest this, Mr. Speaker, to have input, for one. They're not going to get the input, I don't believe, the justified input that they could have if we could delay this for 6 months, Mr. Speaker. That's all we're asking for, is to delay this for 6 months so that people in this province can look at this piece of legislation, digest it, just like the members of my caucus can, and come to an assumption about it, Mr. Speaker. Come to a conclusion that it's not perfect, or we like it, we don't like it. There should be some changes there, Mr. Speaker, but they're not going to be given that opportunity, especially with how quickly the process of approving pieces of legislation in this chamber, Mr. Speaker. One of the other reasons why we're standing up and pointing out some of the flaws in this piece of legislation is that the lack of consultation, not only with the public, but with the other political parties. Now, I can't speak on behalf of the third party on how much consultation they had, Mr. Speaker, with the government on this. I know that there is some agreement between the Liberal Party and the Conservative government on exchanging support for pieces of legislation. Maybe this is one of them, Mr. Speaker, I don't know. But we haven't seen that consultation that I think Nova Scotians want to see when there's a minority government here in this province, Mr. Speaker. There's been a minority government for nearly 4 years now, Mr. Speaker, and we have to respect their wishes. The government, the Conservative Party, won in the last general election. We respect that. We respect the roles and responsibility that government has in providing and bringing forward pieces of legislation, Mr. Speaker, but they have to understand and respect that they don't have a majority, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotians spoke very loudly in the last election, Mr. Speaker, very loudly. Not only did the government lose seats, Mr. Speaker, but the third party lost seats, Mr. Speaker, and our party gained seats, Mr. Speaker, in the last election. And that's a strong message that was sent, not only to the governing party, but to the third party, that voters recognize the work we do over the last several years, before I was even elected, before 2003, Mr. Speaker. The hard work that my caucus members have done over the years to try to garnish that support with voters and try to show that we're here to speak on their behalf and bring their concerns forward, Mr. Speaker. And that lack of consulting with us, Mr. Speaker, is one of the reasons, as I stated, why we're here today and why we're debating this evening on changes that we believe is needed to this piece of legislation. We have in the province, Mr. Speaker, the Election Commission. I've read, I believe they tabled their report earlier in this session, Mr. Speaker, around changes that the Election Commission would like to see in electoral reform, Mr. Speaker, in this province. And that commission is made up of members of the Conservative Party, members of the Liberal Party, members of our caucus, Mr. Speaker, the NDP caucus. And that's, I believe, is the right approach. They also have, I believe, the chief electoral officer of the province on that. And there's ways for the public to have input on making changes to the process of elections. And I think they could make changes to the process of how we fund elections and how party fundraising happens in this province, Mr. Speaker. But that step wasn't taken. That wasn't offered to our party. That wasn't offered to the residents of the province. It wasn't brought forward to that commission, Mr. Speaker, and I don't understand why. That's one reason why we're standing here, is we don't understand why. Over the last 3 years, 3.5 years, I can say, Mr. Speaker, that there has been an understanding between government and the opposition Liberal Party in pieces of legislation to try to move them forward, move them through this House, to try to bring good public policy to Nova Scotia because of the situation, the environment we have here in the province, the minority government. I can honestly say that our environment here in the province is nothing like, or it hasn't been up to this time, and I'll get to that later, Mr. Speaker, it has nothing been like what we see with the minority government in federal politics, Mr. Speaker. That is very volatile, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of relationship or working together in the House of Commons when we're dealing with federal pieces of legislation, Mr. Speaker. The voters see that. I see that. They tell me about that, Mr. Speaker. So I would expect and I would hope that we would have seen the same working relationship that we've seen over the last 3.5 years from the Conservative government on this issue. This is an important issue, one that I think all members here want to see changes in. And they want to see positive changes, Mr. Speaker. They want to see that the political parties in this province take electoral, I'll have problems with that word today, I think, electoral reform seriously, Mr. Speaker. We need to show voters, we need to show Nova Scotians that we all want changes. We all want it, I think. I believe, honestly, that every member here believes that things need to change, that, you know, the history of political fundraising and election fundraising has had many blemishes and is really is embarrassing, Mr. Speaker. I think we should all agree on that, and there needs to be changes, but they need to make those changes in the most appropriate way, Mr. Speaker.
Will the member allow for an introduction?
Sure.
Thank you. The honourable member from Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague from Sackville-Cobequid. I want to bring the House's attention to the West Gallery. Interesting that we're discussing this debate and allowing the participation, or asking for the participation of fellow Nova Scotians, and I want to bring the attention of the House. Brian LeBlanc is a young New Democrat and a constituent of mine, and I just want to have the House acknowledge him and wish him a warm welcome. Brian?
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Now, where was it, Mr. Speaker? Oh, yes, a few brief words on this Bill 117. One of the things why I'm standing here tonight, Mr. Speaker, is to talk about why we need this amendment to happen, Mr. Speaker. And we don't have to look too far, Mr. Speaker. I categorize it in 3 different areas, and I'll talk a little bit about each. And that's the history of elections and election funding and party funding, Mr. Speaker, in this province. The other one is the current practice that we have now, Mr. Speaker, in the province, and what we see today in election funding and party fundraising, and what the future could hold and what the possibilities are about election funding and party funding in the future, Mr. Speaker. I think electoral reform is needed and wanted by Nova Scotians and all Canadians for that matter, Mr. Speaker. This isn't just a provincial issue. We're seeing and hearing the same issues across the country in different provinces, different jurisdictions. We're seeing the same demand from the voters, from the citizens on the federal level that we need changes. And we're seeing those changes. And we're hoping that there'll be positive changes. But, you know, once we start to make those changes, Mr. Speaker, I think that we need to make sure that this legislation is strong and as it's the right legislation for the people of the province, for the parties that are involved in elections here in Nova Scotia, and that we have that involvement, that consultation with the voters, Mr. Speaker. Because ultimately, this piece of legislation, if passed, will implicate on what voters in this province, what taxpayers are in this province are paying, Mr. Speaker, for funding political parties in this province. So ultimately, voters see every day the amount of taxes taken off their income every day, every month, Mr. Speaker, and they question where it's going. And I think we need to give them the opportunity to have a say on where their hard-earned money is going, Mr. Speaker, and especially with a bill like this that implicates the amount of money that each party is going to get and the funding, which ultimately comes from the taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. And in this process that we've seen so far, they have no ability to put that forward, Mr. Speaker, to tell the government that we don't want to see it this way. We would rather see it this way. There might be a better way of doing this, Mr. Speaker. We don't have all the answers, Mr. Speaker. Government doesn't have all the answers, and the Liberal Party doesn't have the answers, Mr. Speaker. We need to make sure that the people in this province who might have a better answer, who do have a better answer, are consulted, are acknowledged, are able to give that input in this process, Mr. Speaker. So we're not saying get rid of this bill. We're not saying let's vote against it, kill it, never see it again, put it on a shelf and let the dust, make the dust grow on it, Mr. Speaker. We just want a little bit of time so that those experts in our province, those individuals who want to see the changes, who would love to have the opportunity to have input on this, have that ability. And currently, the way this is going through this House, they're not going to have that opportunity, Mr. Speaker. The public has a disconnect with politicians, Mr. Speaker. They have a disconnect with the political process. And you don't have to take my word for it, Mr. Speaker. You look at the voter turnout in the last election in this summer, Mr. Speaker. The voter turnout is down. It might be even a record low, Mr. Speaker. And I think that disconnect will just continue to grow if we don't, as MLAs, and if government doesn't, as the governing party, don't start to engage them, to include them in the political process, include them in the bills, the changing of public policy, Mr. Speaker, then we're going to continue to have that decline, and there's going to continue to be a disconnect between the voters, the residents of this province, and myself and my colleagues and the members, all members of this House, Mr. Speaker. There's a disconnect. And I don't believe, Mr. Speaker, I must say this, I don't believe that we would see this bill come forward in this manner under the John Ham former government, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe we would. I don't believe we would, Mr. Speaker. And we all know that this is not the John Ham government. We all know that. Over the last 6 months, they've acted more like the John Buchanan government, Mr. Speaker, not the John Ham government. And I think they need to take a step back and recognize the road they're going down is not a road of success, Mr. Speaker. Maybe I shouldn't tell them this, Mr. Speaker, because maybe I should allow them to keep going down the road they're going, because after the last election, we realized the benefits of them traveling down that road, Mr. Speaker. As I said, our caucus was the only caucus that increased our members. We have 5 new members, actually 6 new members, but 5 extra seats, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's a strong message to this government on what the citizens of this province want to see. And they want to see that cooperation, as I talked about earlier. They want to see that consultation because, as I said, we have a minority government. And it only makes sense. If this government wants to stay in power a little longer, I think they have to realize that consultation, that negotiation, that working relationship with our party, with the Liberal Party, has to improve, Mr. Speaker. It can't be just one-sided in this House, Mr. Speaker. It can't be one-sided in this House. Another reason, Mr. Speaker, around my support of this amendment and the changes I believe that we need to see is definitely around, as I said, the history of political funding in this province. And I'm, of course, talking about the Liberal Trust Fund, Mr. Speaker. We've heard about it over the last 2 days. I know you're aware of it, Mr. Speaker. And I don't blame you, Mr. Speaker, or any members of this Liberal caucus about the situation around the trust fund, Mr. Speaker. They weren't members when all this transpired, Mr. Speaker. So I don't blame you. I don't blame you for what happened many, many years ago, Mr. Speaker. I know that you inherited this problem, but it doesn't mean you can't act on it, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal Trust Fund has really been a sore point in our political history around fundraising, Mr. Speaker. We all know there was an investigation that led to a conviction of 2 party officials, Mr. Speaker, in the early 80s for influence peddling, Mr. Speaker. The Crown proved at the time, Mr. Speaker, when they went to court, that the men had operated, the 2 men that were convicted, there was 3 men charged. One was found not guilty, but there was 2 charged and convicted, Mr. Speaker, around operating a toll gating, as they called it, in the information that I read, in the history that I read, Mr. Speaker, around toll gating scheme that got liquor stores to and breweries to pay a percentage of the sales of the Nova Scotia liquor stores back to the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker. Back to the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker. I mean, that should have never happened. I think everybody here would agree that that should have never happened, and there was actually a conviction, and it should have been over then, Mr. Speaker, but it wasn't. This has dragged on for, what, over 30 years, Mr. Speaker, and today we're still discussing this trust fund, where the money came from, how it was obtained, Mr. Speaker. There was a trial, conviction, fines paid, Mr. Speaker. 30-some years later, we're still discussing it, and it's very pertinent to this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. I know in this legislation it states that you cannot, that the Liberal Party cannot use it during an election campaign. But what stops them from, in between that election campaign, spending it in ways that will improve them, give them a head start, give them a few steps out of the blocks, Mr. Speaker, in the next election? We all know during the last, just before the last campaign, Mr. Speaker, that the members of the Liberal Party, one of the members from Cape Breton South, had stated that they couldn't go to war with an empty gun, Mr. Speaker. I remember the member from Cape Breton South said that. He also said that the Liberal Party was having difficulty raising money because individuals knew that there was this trust fund. And they can't understand if you're coming to me and asking me for money, that why don't you spend your own money? Why don't you spend the trust fund, Mr. Speaker? So I know it's difficult for you, Mr. Speaker, and for the rest of members of your caucus to raise funds because of the blemish that happened many years ago. I know it wasn't on your watch, Mr. Speaker, but it happened many years ago, and many of your members have been involved in the party for many years, many years. And I think to take the next step forward in reforming fundraising procedures for parties in this province, that you need to get rid of that money, Mr. Speaker. I know members before me have stated a number of options. There's all kinds of things that you could do with that money, Mr. Speaker. You give it back to the taxpayers of this province. Because during the investigation, Mr. Speaker, after the conviction, there was an audit done by the Liberal Party to try to figure out where the money came from and figure out who actually contributed to that. And a portion of that they could actually figure out that came from the rollbacks and the kickbacks from the liquor sales, Mr. Speaker. But there was a large portion of that. I believe that portion was about $1 million or more dollars, Mr. Speaker. 1.3 million, I believe, Mr. Speaker. But there was still $4 million left that they actually couldn't figure out where it came from, Mr. Speaker. There was no trail. There was no way of explaining to Nova Scotians where it came from. So ultimately, it could have came from the kickbacks. I can't say it did, but it could have, because we can't say it didn't. We can't say it didn't, Mr. Speaker. And I think they need to do the right thing, especially now, Mr. Speaker, where I know you have an interim leader, you have a convention coming up in April, you have a leadership race in this province, Mr. Speaker, and I think that the Liberal supporters in this province want you to do the same thing. They want you to do the right thing, Mr. Speaker. They want you to clean this out, get rid of it. You know, this wasn't your doing, this wasn't your party's doing, it was done in the past. Get rid of it and let's start over, and then that would be true reform of political fundraising here in this province, Mr. Speaker. I think you need to do that, Mr. Speaker. No, not yet. Not yet. So I think it's important that those members in the Liberal Party who are contemplating running, Mr. Speaker, that this is something that they're going to have to try to address over the next several months before their convention, before you choose your leader, Mr. Speaker, and before the next election. And I think by offering a 6-month break, Mr. Speaker, to delay this piece of legislation would allow your party to consult with your members, with Nova Scotians, on what the most appropriate way is to proceed when we're dealing with the Liberal Trust Fund, Mr. Speaker, and what you should do down the road. We need to clean that up, Mr. Speaker, and I believe your members don't want this hanging over their shoulders. I believe that the next Liberal leader doesn't want this hanging over their shoulders, Mr. Speaker, and it comes up every time, especially around the an election, Mr. Speaker. It comes up every time. I've read it over the years, and I think it would be better for you just to get rid of that, Mr. Speaker. But during the trial, Mr. Speaker, of the 2 men who were convicted, defense lawyers during that trial openly referred to the political nature and questioned the RCMP investigation of Tory fundraising practices, Mr. Speaker. Not just Liberal, but Tory fundraising practices, which, in accordance to the RCMP corporal on the stand at the time, Mr. Speaker, that investigation had to end because they had learned that the Conservative documents had been burned, Mr. Speaker, around the fundraising and how their practices were. So this is not just a one-party thing, Mr. Speaker. This has happened with the Conservative Party many years ago, Mr. Speaker. We have a deep blemish in the history of fundraising for political parties in this province. So I think we all need to do the right thing, Mr. Speaker. We all need to take the right steps forward in ensuring that this legislation is the best that possibly it can be, Mr. Speaker, for the future. For MLAs that will come after us, Mr. Speaker, that will have to deal with this again and again if we don't do it right the first time. And by rushing it through this House, we're not doing it right, Mr. Speaker. That's why we need to delay this. We need to have that time to reflect, to engage the voters here in this province, to find out what road and what changes they want to see. It shouldn't be what changes I want to see or what changes my party wants to see or the Liberals or the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker. It's what the voters, it's what the taxpayers, the residents of this province, what the residents of this province want to see. Those are the changes that we need to be looking at and the amendments that need to be made to this bill. And I said if this process continues and how quickly the process of bills going through this House continue, then we won't get those changes. We won't get the amendments that Nova Scotians want and deserve and actually expect, Mr. Speaker. They expect changes and positive changes. I also said I support this amendment by the Leader of the Official Opposition, the member from Cole Harbour, because and I'll talk around the current conditions of what we have today in political fundraising and party fundraising, Mr. Speaker. I know today this piece of legislation deals with setting limits. I believe a $5,000 limit for corporate donations, a $1,000 individual donation, Mr. Speaker. And we've stated it already that we feel that that's too high. We don't want that, Mr. Speaker. We all throw snowballs around here around election time, Mr. Speaker, on how we get our funding during an election, prior to an election, after an election, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives seem to get the snowball. It says they get it from corporate donations. They seem to throw the snowball at us where we get it from union donations, and the Liberals, of course, with the Liberal Trust Fund, slush fund, Mr. Speaker. So we all throw these snowballs, but we don't take time to step back and say, well, let's make positive changes. Let's stop throwing the snowballs, Mr. Speaker, and do it right so that it is fair, it's transparent, it's open, residents of this province are able to understand how it works. Right now they don't, Mr. Speaker. They're very skeptical of the political fundraising that goes on in this province, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the corporations and the unions that donate during campaigns, and I'll admit we go there because we have to. I believe they don't want to donate to our parties, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to give money to us, but they feel obligated. They feel obligated that they do this. Mr. Speaker, I look at the corporate donations for a little while, and I'll talk about that. And I think that businesses in this province feel like they have an obligation to fund or to give funds to political parties, Mr. Speaker. And I feel that they don't need to do that. I feel that they feel that they need to, if government scratches your back, you need to scratch their back, Mr. Speaker. And I think that corporations in this province feel it necessary and that it's just a part of doing business here in Nova Scotia. Well, Mr. Speaker, if we wipe that out, if we got rid of corporate donations in this province, then corporations will look at this province, I believe, in a positive light and say, here, we can go to Nova Scotia. We don't need to act like we've done in the past. We don't need to act like we do in other provinces in our capital around whoever's in government. We need to make sure that they get donations, that we scratch their back. And if we don't, what are the consequences, Mr. Speaker? What are the consequences? Well, we don't know, but I'll highlight a few of them. I know that currently in this province, I sit on the Public Accounts Committee, Mr. Speaker, and we have many organizations, many departments of the government come forward to talk around the issues of government policy and the procedures. And one of the things we just found out, Mr. Speaker, a little while ago was around the SAP program that the Department of Finance has initiated in this province around the computer system and the operations of accountability here in this province, Mr. Speaker. And the SAP program actually is the name of the company. It's a worldwide company, I believe one of the largest companies in the world that provide the services to many companies throughout the world, Mr. Speaker, and or SAP program, Mr. Speaker. And SAP Canada was actually the one who was given the contract. It was an untendered contract at that, Mr. Speaker, to provide the services for this province. And actually going through the political donation books, Mr. Speaker, we see that SAP Canada actually gave money to the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker. And I think that is just, it shouldn't happen. It sends the wrong messages, the wrong message to business out there, Mr. Speaker. This is a worldwide company, and what do they say to people in other countries? That, well, we have the contract in Nova Scotia, but we gave the political party a donation during the election. So I guess it's part of doing business, Mr. Speaker. It's part of doing business. And I feel that corporations shouldn't have that over their heads when they come to this province. We're trying to create business opportunities here in this province, and I think this is just one area that if we got rid of it, that it would benefit the attraction of businesses to our province and grow the economy here in our province, Mr. Speaker. Another one is the S&J potato, Mr. Speaker. That was another one that we talked about in public accounts, Mr. Speaker. Here's a company that received funding from this province, Mr. Speaker, received a guaranteed loan, a forgivable guaranteed loan, Mr. Speaker, yet they were leasing land from one of the members of the cabinet, Mr. Speaker. So what does that show? What image, does that project to the business world out there, Mr. Speaker? It sends the wrong message, Mr. Speaker. Wrong message, because I don't think they want to, corporations don't want to perceive that they're scratching the back of government. I think if we got rid of the corporate donations, that we could solve that problem, Mr. Speaker. And that's why I think we need to support amending this piece of legislation and get that delay, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'll talk about another business in this province, Mr. Speaker, who came to the government for assistance, and we'll talk about Snare's Bakery. They were here for many years, Mr. Speaker, I think over 60 years, if I'm not mistaken. They came to government. They're a family-run business. They asked for assistance from this government. Did they get it, Mr. Speaker? No. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, from all the evidence I looked at, they never gave any money to political party, Mr. Speaker. And now they're not here. They're over in PEI, Mr. Speaker. They're gone.
Order, please. I think that's drifting afar from the issue of the hoist motion before the House. If you get back on that, please. Now a member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But what it does show is that if we changed and made amendments and received 6 months to try to even look at the corporate businesses in this province and ask them what reform they'd like to see, what changes in political donation to this province, what they think, I think we'd get an earful, Mr. Speaker. In the next 6 months, we should be doing that. That's why I support the amendment to Bill 117, Mr. Speaker, that corporate companies in this province could have input, just like the taxpayers. Just the regular residents, Mr. Speaker, pay taxes. I stated that earlier, and they should be involved in this process. But businesses in this province pay a lot of taxes also, Mr. Speaker, and I think they want government to bring forward positive changes to the way parties are fundraised, especially during an election, Mr. Speaker. I believe that those changes could happen if only we were given the time of 6 months to review this and consult with Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, not only just individuals, but corporations and companies, Mr. Speaker. Those who are running our economy, who are providing the money for this government to implement their policies, Mr. Speaker, to implement their policies. And I've stated before that we owe it to them. We owe it to them. Many of these corporations, these companies, they're voters, Mr. Speaker. They have employees who vote. And we know the result of the last election, Mr. Speaker, was a minority government. Just like in 2003, Mr. Speaker, and I believe that that sends a message that policy and bills that come through this House need to be the best that they can be to ensure that the wishes of those taxpayers, those voters, those residents in this province, the wishes that they have are listened to and are acted upon by the government and by all members, by members of the opposition, by members of the third party, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important that we do that. The one thing also, Mr. Speaker, why we're making amendments to, I believe someone would like to make an introduction, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have an opportunity, and I appreciate the member from Sackville-Cobequid for giving me a few minutes. In the West Gallery this evening, we have some visitors from other parts of the world who are here, and I wanted to recognize them. Not from another part of the world, but my CA, Dorothy Boudreau.
Eastern Passage.
Cole Harbour. She lives in Cole Harbour. Her daughter, Emma Pratt, who's also here, and also J.D. Fisher. And then also my CA, Dorothy, also is the host family for 2 exchange students. One, Carolina Mesa from Colombia, and the other, Min Ha Han from Korea. So if you could all stand and receive the endorsement of the House.
Indeed, welcome to our guests to the legislature this evening. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on the hoist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too welcome the guests to the session this evening. And what we're talking about, just in case they just come in, Mr. Speaker, is we're talking about a piece of legislation. No, I won't stir up. A piece of legislation that was introduced by government to change the way we fundraise in this province, Mr. Speaker. Change ways how political parties in this province receive their funds during an election and in between elections, Mr. Speaker. And we, the member from Cole Harbour, the member or the leader of the official opposition, presented an amendment to this bill stating that we needed more time to consult. We needed 6 months Mr. Speaker, so that we could take this process, this important process that we're going through, and go to the public, Mr. Speaker, go to the businesses in Nova Scotia, get input, get consultation, find out what the right way of doing this is, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I don't believe the 52 members in this chamber have all the answers when it comes to this, these changes that is proposed in Bill 117, Mr. Speaker. We don't have all the answers, and we need to seek those answers out. And by not hoisting this, Mr. Speaker, and allowing some time to digest this, then I think we'll have a flawed piece of legislation move through this House, and something that we can't have happen, Mr. Speaker. This bill talks about political party fundraising, Mr. Speaker, during an election and around an election. What this bill doesn't talk about is how political parties spend that money, Mr. Speaker. I think that should be part of this legislation. I think that's why we need 6 months to consult, to digest this, Mr. Speaker. It talks nothing about how political parties can spend their money, Mr. Speaker, and I think we need to go down that road. Nova Scotians expect and want us to have changes to the way we raise money in this province, not only on a provincial level, Mr. Speaker, but on a federal level. And that's one of the other reasons why we're supporting this amendment, Mr. Speaker, is that right now, currently, there are changes in the federal system, Mr. Speaker, that specifically states some of the things that we are requesting, Mr. Speaker. The limits, Mr. Speaker. We want to see a $1,000 limit for individuals, Mr. Speaker, and take away corporate and union donations. Get rid of them. I know that'll hurt our party, Mr. Speaker. It'll hurt the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker, and it'll hurt the Liberal Party. But we need to get rid of that. And I don't understand why this piece of legislation is so different than the parent party of the Conservative government in this province, Mr. Speaker. They're the ones that introduced the legislation on the federal in the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker. And this bill that the Nova Scotia Conservative Party introduced is not similar, and I don't think it goes as far as what our federal counterparts are going, Mr. Speaker, and I believe it's being accepted. I know, as I mentioned before, there's a Liberal leadership race here in the province, but there's one also going on the federal side, Mr. Speaker, and they're actually following the changes that have happened with funding, Mr. Speaker, where it's required for any Liberal or any leadership candidate to divulge where they get their funding, Mr. Speaker. But in this piece of legislation, it doesn't state that. No. If you're running for leadership of a party, Mr. Speaker, you don't have to divulge where you got your funding. And it's wrong, Mr. Speaker. That's why we need to step back, look at this, take the 6 months to see how, for one, see how the Liberal leadership race in the federal politics, Mr. Speaker, how that transpires, and make sure that the process and the changes that we've seen on the federal side are working, that they're implemented right, Mr. Speaker. But we're trying to shotgun this through this legislature, Mr. Speaker. They're trying to shotgun this through the legislature so that I think we don't have the opportunity to consult. We don't have the opportunity to seek input from experts in the field, from taxpayers in this province, from corporations, Mr. Speaker, and that's an injustice. I think it's wrong, and that's why member after member in our caucus are standing up and promoting the fact that this is not right and that we need time. We need 6 months to look at this, and that I believe it's something that the government members and the Liberal members should support. They should support this amendment, Mr. Speaker. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that I've noticed reading through political funding, not only in our country, not in our province, but you just have to look to the south of us, Mr. Speaker, and during their elections, Mr. Speaker, in not in Yarmouth, but down in the States, Mr. Speaker. And down in the States, Mr. Speaker, I know that they're going through midterm elections now, Mr. Speaker, and the House, or have just finished midterm elections, Mr. Speaker, for the House and Senate and Congress. And they spend, Mr. Speaker, individuals spend and raise during the political process in the States, Mr. Speaker, well over $200 million each, Mr. Speaker. $200 million each in the U.S., Mr. Speaker. I can say, Mr. Speaker, that if that was me, I would not be able to run for political office, and I think that would be a shame, Mr. Speaker, because I believe that everyone in this province should be given the opportunity to seek office if they choose, to take that step into the political life, Mr. Speaker, so they could come to the floor of this legislature and bring the concerns of their residents who elect them, but not only them, but residents of the whole province, Mr. Speaker, whatever your role is here in this legislature, if it's with government, if it's with the official opposition, or with the third party, Mr. Speaker, you have the opportunity to get here and promote what people in the province want to see. And I don't think they'd like to see this piece of legislation pass through in that shotgun fashion I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker. I think we need an amendment to this bill, the amendment that the leader of the official opposition proposed on Monday. I believe that he was genuine in that amendment, and we support him, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. There's too much noise in the chamber. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, all members elected, all 52 of us, need to ensure that we bring forward good policy, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, the process of bringing bills through this House is very quick, Mr. Speaker, very quick. And it doesn't give a lot of opportunity for the public, for interest groups, for businesses, for individuals to make comments through the process. Yes, we do offer them maybe a day, maybe 2 days' notice on the process of law amendments when a bill gets through second reading, Mr. Speaker, and into law amendments. We do give them that opportunity, but 2 days' notice is not a lot, Mr. Speaker, especially when we're dealing with changes like this, changes that will cost taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. These changes will cost taxpayers of our province, Mr. Speaker, and I think without consulting them, it does the process an injustice, Mr. Speaker, and I think we need to step back and reflect and consult with individuals, Mr. Speaker. Allow them that time to put their input in on what changes they'd like to see. That's why I believe we need the 6 months, Mr. Speaker. We need to support the amendment to Bill 117 to allow for that time to give those who have an interest in change, Mr. Speaker, in this province, the opportunity to make an impression on us, Mr. Speaker, on government, on the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker. I also talked around the future, Mr. Speaker, the future of election funding in this province. And one reason why I'm supporting this amendment, Mr. Speaker, is that to ensure that the members that follow after us, Mr. Speaker, we're not all going to be here forever. Members are going to be here after us, Mr. Speak. Members after me need to know that we made positive changes that I hope help the political process, help an individual in this province get elected if they choose, Mr. Speaker, no matter where they come from, no matter what their background, no matter their financial...
Order, please. There's too much noise in the chamber, and the honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid has the floor.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, no matter what their background is, Mr. Speaker, I think we need to make positive changes for the future so that the MLAs that come after us can concentrate on other things. I heard one comment, Mr. Speaker, from the Liberal Party, a member from the Liberal Party, that they'd rather be speaking on something more important. But, Mr. Speaker, unless we make these changes, Mr. Speaker, and make the most appropriate changes, Mr. Speaker, then I don't think we can go through other processes here in the legislature, Mr. Speaker. I think we need to make sure that this piece of legislation is the best it can be. And by having it rush through this House, it's not going to be, Mr. Speaker. It lacks the consultation, as I said before. It lacks the input from those experts in the field that might be able to give more to this than what government and those who created this bill have, Mr. Speaker, so that the future, the MLAs, the governing parties in the future can concentrate on other bills, Mr. Speaker, on good public policies, on changes, other than reform to the way parties are funded here in this province, Mr. Speaker. We have to take those steps, and we got to take them slowly, Mr. Speaker. I'm not saying let's take 10 years to consult and hire consultants to look at this and bring back a report and have a committee, Mr. Speaker. We need 6 months. We just need 6 months, Mr. Speaker, so that we can get that input, so that we can make sure that this piece of legislation is clear, it's transparent, it's appropriate, not only for ourselves, not only for our political parties, but appropriate for the taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. And this bill doesn't go far enough, Mr. Speaker. That's why we have made the amendment. That's why we support the amendment. And that's why we're encouraging all members here to take a serious look at this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and make sure that we take that time to make sure it's right. Make sure it's right. We need to restore the confidence in the voters in this province, Mr. Speaker. So maybe the next election we'll see an increase in the voter turnout, Mr. Speaker. More people will be engaged. They won't be so disconnected with political parties, won't be so cynical when it comes to party fundraising in this province, Mr. Speaker. They won't be so cynical. And we all read the papers. We all know what people are saying, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting today in the paper, Mr. Speaker, there were several titles. I'm sure you read them. I'm sure most members of this party read them. And one of the papers was Tory political fundraising bill riddled with holes, Mr. Speaker. And that was from Marilla Stevenson. And she actually states that you could drive a truck right through this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. A Brinks truck, Mr. Speaker. Ironic she uses that, Mr. Speaker, right through the holes in this piece of legislation. So that's not just the opposition.
Order, please. Order, please. Maybe the members of the caucus for the member of Sackville-Cobequid would join the rest of the members of this House in allowing him to be heard by the Speaker. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, Marilla Stevenson stated that you could drive a Brinks truck through the holes in this legislation. So the government doesn't have to take our word for it. They don't have to just listen to our caucus, Mr. Speaker. Read the papers. Maybe the reporters have a bit more knowledge than we do here in the House. Maybe they're one of the ones that should be consulted, Mr. Speaker. But by rushing this piece of legislation through the House, they're not going to have the opportunity. They'll just continue to write stories like this. And as I said before, if this government wants to continue down the road they're going, then I'm not going to stop them, Mr. Speaker. I've stated in the past the results after the last election where we've had an increase in members here in our caucus, and I believe it's from the lack of leadership from government on important pieces of legislation, just like Bill number 117, Mr. Speaker. And I think they need to show the leadership now. Mr. Premier, you can change the path you've taken for this piece of legislation. Agree to the amendment, put it off for 6 months, and do the consulting that we think needs to happen, Mr. Speaker. We won't hold anything against you if you change your mind, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Premier, we know you've done it in the past. You're more than happy to do it again, Mr. Speaker. You're more than happy to do it again, Mr. Speaker. So we won't hold it against you or your government to change the course of this legislation and allow the time and the input that is needed to make sure that this legislation is really strong enough and better, Mr. Speaker. And I had a rude awakening, Mr. Speaker, when I ran in 2003. in the, to join in the political process, to figure out what a campaign has, Mr. Speaker, and what it's entailed, the work involved, Mr. Speaker, not only on my behalf, but many of the people who worked to get me here and get me elected, Mr. Speaker. And one of the areas which was very difficult to grasp is definitely campaign fundraising, Mr. Speaker. Fundraising, going to the people that you're trying to get their vote, Mr. Speaker, the people who say they're going to support you, and ask them for money, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that was one of the hardest things I had to learn and how to deal with, Mr. Speaker. And I can say, Mr. Speaker, in 2003, thanks to the Conservative government, that fundraising was a little easier, and I'm sure most members here in my caucus was a little easier, because it seemed ironic that the number of $155 donations that I received were quite high, Mr. Speaker. $150 donations that I received that election that I didn't receive in '06, which I missed, definitely, Mr. Speaker, but it showed, I think it was an indication at the time of what the public wanted and what the public desired and what the public would accept. And they never accepted those $155 checks, Mr. Speaker. They sent them to us. They sent them to me, Mr. Speaker, to get me elected, to ensure, I believe, that I stand here in my place and make sure that I bring their concerns to the floor of this legislature and ensure that the pieces of legislation that go through this House are the ones that the public wants, Mr. Speaker. I believe that was a message that I got back in 2003, Mr. Speaker, and I haven't forgot that, and I work every day to ensure that. That's why I believe this piece of legislation needs to be amended, needs to have that time to give us and give the Nova Scotians the ability to make sure that we're taking the proper steps, Mr. Speaker, in the changes that they want to see. The changes that they want to see, Mr. Speaker. And I think we need to do the right thing. And I said it before that all parties will lose when this piece of legislation goes through, or if it goes through. I hope it's changed, it's amended, so it's even stronger, Mr. Speaker, that we all lose, that all the parties start off that next election, whenever it will be, this spring, Mr. Speaker, next spring, Mr. Speaker, whenever it is, that we're on a level and even playing field, and that all the skepticism that revolves political fundraising, Mr. Speaker, are limited or are gone. They won't be gone for many years, I don't think, Mr. Speaker. They need we need to make sure that the public have confidence in the election process, Mr. Speaker, and the funding of political parties in this province, Mr. Speaker. And I think we need to see legislation that does that, Mr. Speaker. I had mentioned earlier around trust funds and corporate donations and union donations, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's important that we recognize that it's not a one-sided issue, Mr. Speaker. All three political parties have had a past when it comes to political fundraising that some Nova Scotians don't like. They would like to see changes, Mr. Speaker, if it's with unions, with ourselves, Mr. Speaker, if it's corporations with the Conservatives, or if it's with the infamous trust fund that the Liberal Party has, Mr. Speaker. I think we need to make sure the changes come forward, that Nova Scotians are consulted, and that this legislation is a strong piece of legislation that will ensure the future, that future MLAs, future parties, future individuals in this province who run don't run under a cloud of skepticism, Mr. Speaker, a cloud of disconnect from the voters, from those individuals who might have some cynicism around fundraising here in this province, Mr. Speaker. And I think that's why this piece of legislation needs to be amended. We need to support the amendment brought forward by the member from Cole Harbour, the leader of the official opposition, Mr. Speaker. He's doing the right thing. We're doing the right thing, Mr. Speaker, in supporting that that amendment to this bill, Mr. Speaker, and I think all members of this House need to do the right thing, and that's support this amendment, Mr. Speaker, and just step back. As I said, we're not saying we don't want reform. We're not saying that we aren't going to make changes, Mr. Speaker. So I think, Mr. Speaker, that with the comments that the government have heard on this issue, that they can make those changes. They can take that opportunity to step back and make sure that this piece of legislation passes. And I believe if we have the time to consult with Nova Scotians and engage them, get their input, that this piece of legislation would pass unanimously in this legislature, Mr. Speaker, with support from all members, if we only have and take that time to make sure it's the best possible piece of legislation. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I adjourn debate on Bill 117, Mr. Speaker.
Debate being adjourned. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to call public bills for second reading, and I would like to deal with Bill 119, the Elections Act.
Bill number 119, the Elections Act.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be very brief in my remarks on the Elections Act. We've heard very great amount today about elections generally in the House, and I won't try to repeat that other than to say that this is a bill that has been put forward by the Chief Electoral Officer of Nova Scotia that I understand has broad support with all three political parties, and that is in the interest of Nova Scotia. They're not what we call technical changes. They're important changes, but they're changes that would change the rules in a way that makes sense to most Nova Scotians. With that, I'd move second reading of the bill.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on Bill 119, our party is glad to see it move over to law amendments. It's a good bill. It's one that addresses concerns that have been raised through the legitimate process that we have in this province with regard to the Electoral Commission and the Chief Electoral Officer. And we're glad to see it move. We want to hear from the people of Nova Scotia. I think these are good changes for Nova Scotia. I think they'll do well to improve the Election Act and ensure we have a much fairer process with regard to elections in this province. So our party is glad to support Bill 119.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise on second reading of Bill 119, the Elections Act. As has been pointed out, these are as a result of changes recommended by the Chief Electoral Officer, and I certainly want to take this opportunity on behalf of our caucus. I believe it's our Chief Electoral Officer's first general election since assuming her new role, and certainly want to commend her and her staff for the wonderful job that was carried out in the last election and for the continued changes that are being looked at. Speaker, I can tell you personally that any efforts to improve Nova Scotians' ability to vote, especially in rural areas with the mail-in ballot, I certainly welcome. I can tell you, while it's been an improvement over the old proxy vote system and trying to chase down doctors to sign papers for people who could not make it out to the polls, I can tell you in a rural community such as Richmond, where you have one returning office, which is usually located in Discouse, that's about an hour and a half away from the other end of my riding, which is the Foshu-Framboise area. So there are a number of logistical concerns in the fact that under our current rules, you still had to travel to the electoral office to get the paperwork and do the registration. So any attempts to improve that system and make it easier for residents, especially in rural communities where you may only have one returning office that's not always convenient or close to electors, I think is just one example of some of the positive changes being proposed here. And I think this certainly fits in well with Bill number 117 in attempts to improve our election system here in Nova Scotia, both through election financing reform and now through changes to our actual voting process. I believe both bills go together very well, and I'm certainly pleased to see that this bill at least seems to have all party support for sending the signal to Nova Scotians. We want to increase the just over 60% of Nova Scotians who voted in the last election, and we want to try to see how that almost 40% of Nova Scotians can be attracted into exercising their democratic right as easily as possible in participating in the next election, whenever that may take place. Mr. Speaker, we do look forward to the bill moving on to law amendments and any possible recommendations that may result from that process, and one can only hope that Bill number 117 will receive the same speedy passage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance. Will be to close debate on the bill. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments of both honourable members, and my fondest dreams are coming true if that were the case with respect to Bill 117. But we'll take it one bill at a time. And Mr. Speaker, I would move that debate close on Bill 119.
The motion is for second reading of Bill number 119, Elections Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary by nay. The motion is carried.
119, entitled an act to amend Chapter 140 of the revised statutes 1989, the Elections Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government... No. House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that the House now adjourn to sit for the hours tomorrow from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 10 o'clock in the evening. For 4 of those hours would be opposition, NDP opposition hours, and I'll let Mr. DeVoe, rather the Honourable House Leader.
Eastern Passage.
I would let the opposition House Leader speak to that.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From the hours of 2 to 6 will be Opposition Day, and after the order of business daily routine, we will be calling resolutions number 1024 and 1033. And the opposition business will be closing at 6 p.m., and I'm assuming the House Leader will be calling hours after that.
The motion is for the House to adjourn and to meet again tomorrow at the hour of 2 p.m. till 10 p.m. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary by nay. The motion is carried. We stand adjourned. Brooke?